The map bloomed in fire. Each thread of psychic light was a ship, each glow a world. And from the vantage of the choir, the galaxy looked less like a scattering of stars and more like veins inside a living body, bright arteries pumping against the black. But behind the beauty was hunger. For every thread cost a soul, every glow had been bought with the scream of someone bound to a throne. Kaelin felt it as the choir breathed the sensation not of stars twinkling, but of blood surging, ships moving down the veins like red cells driven by a pulse. The galaxy was not empty. It was swollen with motion traffic, endless lifelines stitched thinly across void, and he could feel the weight of humanity carried by their burning. He sensed freighters dragging tithe grain troop carriers swollen with regiments, pilgrim ships bursting with hymns and incense. And through all of it, the same truth without the choir. Without their agony transformed into light, and these ships would drift blind, lost forever in the warp. Yet as his vision stretched outward, the beauty fractured into menace, for every artery ended near something waiting. Chaos came first. Their fleets burned in the sight, not like ships, but like scars, hulls twisted into faces, metal melted until it seemed to scream. Kaelin smelled them before he saw them, ozone fouled with rot copper stench of blood, vaporized a stink that clung to the soul rather than the skin. Their colors were wrong, shifting where no color should shift, banners of impossible hue flickering like wounds in the void. He felt them laugh, and the laughter was knives drawn across bone. Next, the orcs surged, green noise roaring across the choir's perception, not one voice, but millions, all bellowing at once. Their fleets were not fleets, but piles of iron and smoke, hammered into motion, spitting sparks, as if each vessel were an engine misfiring. He could taste their presence like oil, thick on the tongue, bitter and choking, and above it the thunder of drums' fists, pounding on metal voices, daring the galaxy to answer. They were crude, they were chaos in motion, but they were endless, a tide that did not stop, that only laughed when it broke against stone, because it knew it would surge again. Then the Tyranids in Kaelin's mind recoiled, as shadow blotted entire sectors. They did not appear as ships, but as swarms, black clouds, that devoured light wings, that churned oceans of vacuum into storms of soundless hunger. The choir smelled them as acid as meat, turning as the reek of slaughterhouses opened for eternity. Their sound was worse. The clicking of mandibles and the shriek of a billion throats without language, the static buzz of a hive mind that pulsed not as thought, but as appetite. Where they moved, arteries snapped. Where they fed, worlds dimmed and went dark. And beyond them, worse still, the Necrons stirred. At first, Kaelin thought them dead zones, places where light refused to reach, silence thicker than the void itself. But then the cold pressed in, a pressure not of heat lost, but of heat denied, stolen away. Their tomb worlds awakened in silence, no roar, no laughter, no screech, only stillness that spread like a shadow's edge, ships gleaming as metal, older than humanity, rose without haste. Their presence smelled of dust, of stone long buried, of graves pried open, and their color was absence, the lightless gleam of steel under moonless skies. Against them, even chaos felt alive, even orcs felt warm, even Tyranids felt loud. They were silence given teeth. Kaelin shuddered, because in the choir's sight, there was no gap, no safe distance. The arteries of light threaded through a galaxy surrounded on all sides by predators. And the more he looked, the more he knew that their light did not illuminate safety, it merely delayed the inevitable dark. Every pulse of guidance was also a measure of doom's approach, each ship saved today, another target marked for tomorrow. The choir hummed, holding, calculating, intervening, paying. But Kaelin felt the truth gnawing underneath the map was not salvation, it was triage. A wound bound against bleeding out, a prayer shouted into storm. The vision pressed tighter, the arteries narrowing, the colors bleeding into one another, the threats closing in like jaws. And then the focus shifted, pushing inward, dragging the sight away from arteries and predators and blood, to a single point, a single throne. The galaxy was vast, infinite in peril. But the burden narrowed until it bent upon one man. Seated unmoving, one figure upon the golden throne, and through him all of it was carried. 10,000 years in the same chair, 10,000 years of screams burned into memory, 10,000 years of being both God and prisoner, savior and monster. The golden throne held the emperor upright, but it was not a seat of power. It was a cage that consumed. To billions, he was worshipped as divine, but inside the machine his body was chained in wrought nerves, wired to a labyrinth of tubes, flesh crumbling but preserved against collapse. He could not walk, could not raise his hand, could not speak except in fractured whispers that sometimes bled into the minds of the damned whispers, like the one Kalen had heard, "I am sorry." That was all that remained of his voice, a godhood eroded into static. And yet for all his silence, the weight he bore was not silence at all. Gratitude pressed against him, the endless thanks of humanity voices, raised in prayer on billions of worlds, hymns echoing in cathedral hives, banners lifted in his name. But bound into those hymns was also grief and hatred and betrayal. He remembered every name sacrificed to the throne, and he remembered those who cursed his name as they died, who spat into the void at his silence, who damned the God that could not answer. He carried all of it, a ledger of souls carved not into parchment, but into memory that could never forget. No one else could know what it meant to be divine, and yet helpless, omniscient, and yet trapped in iron. Every day was decision. The Astronomican's hunger never ceased. Every day required thousands of lives burned into light, and each one had to be chosen. Which worlds would be culled, which prison ships emptied, which cohorts dragged into the chamber of needles, all of it filtered through protocols that ultimately bent to him. Beyond the walls of Terra, choices stretched further. Which sector starved for lack of grain, because the convoys had to be redirected, which hive endured rebellion, because troops were sent elsewhere, which fleet was guided safely, and which was left blind in the warp to vanish forever. Billions lived or died, not by war alone, but by the narrowing calculus of a god chained to a machine. It was a weight without mercy. It was governance not by will, but by triage. His mind did not drift freely. It was lashed to the galaxy's arteries, pulled apart across 10,000 years of unending crisis. Kalen glimpsed it in fragments through the choir flashes of memory that struck like lightning, a mother's face twisted in prayer. A soldier's hand clutched to a chest wound, a child lifted onto a transport that would never arrive. Billions of faces flickered. Billions of lives consumed, all radiating grief through the choir. But the Emperor himself could not weep. His body had no tears left, his voice, no breath. The sorrow flowed outward, instead carried into the minds of those like Kalen echoes that were both burden and confirmation. And yet the machine demanded reduction. Numbers replaced faces. Readouts replaced cries. The vast was carved into statistics, loss measured in percentages, survival written in probability. His grief was still there, deep as the ocean, but it had to be buried beneath equations. The throne did not accept tears, only data. The choir hummed with its rhythm, not love, not lament, but calculation. Hold, calculate, intervene, pay. And so the vast horror of 10 millennia compressed not into names remembered, but into charts and ledgers where even billions became figures, and the God who remembered everything endured because he had no choice. The Adept's readouts ticked like funeral bells, each syllable mechanical yet heavy with doom. Resonance falling. Efficiency reduced. Throne integrity at 61%. Their voices were monotone, ritualistic, stripped of urgency, but the numbers carried their own weight, a tolling that marked not hours, but endings. The golden throne itself groaned with the sound of age, the vibration of rust, lost beneath sanctified plating, its once shining components corroded into dull husks of machinery. Sacred designs had been forgotten, standard template fragments long lost to time, and what remained was a patchwork of guesswork and prayer. Tech priests swarmed its frame like ants over a carcass, but they no longer repaired. They muttered litanies into corroded circuits, swung censers heavy with incense over sparking conduits, and pressed runes, as if ritual alone could force obedience. Each spark spat out by the dying machine was answered not with tools, but with chants, the incense thickening the air until even fire seemed to choke. The math was cruel, merciless. Even with 1,000 souls burned to ash every day, even with the choir straining their minds into threads of light, the Astronomican could not hold its power forever. The numbers showed it clearly, centuries, not millennia. Projections scrolled across cracked screens in endless lines, decline, inevitable, collapse approaching. What had once been faith, stretched across 10,000 years now, had a visible limit, a cliff toward which all humanity marched. The choir felt it first. Their harmony frayed at the edges, once steady resonance, now disrupted by sudden burnouts. Minds unraveled like threads pulled loose from cloth screams, echoing inside the weave before vanishing into silence. Kalen sensed it when a voice beside him faltered mid-hum and never returned, when a pulse of psychic light sputtered and left a hole that no number of new initiates could fill. The threads were fraying. The hum destabilized, shivering like an engine about to seize, vibrating through every soul lashed to the throne. It was not just exhaustion. It was entropy decline, woven into the very marrow of the machine. Each day the adepts recorded losses, percentages, narrowing margins, closing. The Emperor carried the weight of all souls, but even he could not hold back the arithmetic of decay. The numbers themselves became prayers desperate in their precision. Resonance at 87, latency creeping higher, integrity at 61 and falling. The adepts spoke them like canticles, their voices flat, but their movements quicker, more frantic, their augmetic eyes flicking over dials and readings as though they sought hope in statistics. There was none. And then came the groan. It was not from the adepts, not from the choir. It was from the throne itself. The sound shook the chamber deep and resonant, as if metal lungs exhaled for the last time. Circuits screamed with feedback. Crystal veins pulsed too bright, and the machine's own systems echoed a voice, not in words, but in vibration, the language of a dying god machine. Soon even this will not be enough. The phrase rang not in the ears, but in the bones, carried by the throne's tremor, a truth heavier than any scripture. The adepts froze for a heartbeat, their mechanical hands twitching as though they feared to acknowledge what they had heard. Then, as always, they turned back to numbers, chanting prayers as if repetition could deny decay. But the truth was planted, undeniable, echoing through Kalen's chest as the hum faltered. The choir quivered, destabilized the harmony, threatening collapse. And yet, in that moment of failing, something flickered. A light, faint and fragile, appeared among the endless projections, a data point so improbable, the adepts hissed disbelief. Reports had come through a world far from Terra where something impossible was happening. Innovation. Not ritual, not memory, but creation, a spark that might burn against the dark. As the throne groaned and faltered, that flicker glowed brighter in their reports. The chamber for a breath seemed to lean toward it. The hum of decay wavered, the inevitability of collapse, interrupted by the fragile, improbable promise of something new. In a forgotten sector, a miracle took root where no one expected it. Among factories rusted by centuries and worlds barely clinging to survival, something stirred, a flicker of human innovation, real, and working, something not seen since the dark age of technology. It was not vast, like the Astronomican, not a sun blazing across the warp, but a lantern, fragile and small, coaxed into life by hands unaccustomed to miracles. Scientists, engineers, even ordinary workers labored together, piecing fragments of knowledge into function, repairing where instinct guided them, dreaming where manuals failed. They built a beacon. It glowed faintly at first, its light thin against the dark, but real. Proof that humanity still carried within it the power to create, not only to endure. Hope breathed again. Yet, in the galaxy, hope is never left unchallenged. The spark burned, and immediately predators turned their gaze. Chaos whispered into the dreams of those who built it, their sleep filled with promises of power and visions of twisted futures. Orc warbands caught the scent as predators catch blood in the water, their ships thundering through void lanes with crude laughter. And in the void beyond, Tyrannid fleets shifted course, their great hive senses tilting toward the glow, hungry for its warmth as though it were prey to consume. The beacon's light had not yet stabilized when the storm closed in. But the Emperor knew. His presence stretched across the warp, and through psychers scattered on ships, on worlds, in hidden cells he sent visions. Faces burned with sudden revelation, hands scratched warnings onto walls. Commanders woke screaming with orders already inscribed in their minds. Redeployments triggered across sectors. Fleets diverted, regiments shifted without explanation, but with absolute certainty. And in dreams came fragments of knowledge older than the Imperium itself, bits of STC lore, forbidden patterns long sealed, whispered into minds too fragile to carry them. The beacon was strengthened not by ritual, not by litany, but by knowledge carried from the Emperor's own locked vaults. Still, it was not without cost. The predators came closer, the warp pressed harder, and to shield the spark, the Emperor bled more of his own dwindling strength. The choir strained their harmony, stretched thin as they stabilized currents, redirected flows bore down against the storm. Kalen felt members burn out around him, threads, snapping voices, silenced mid-hum, their essence dissolved to keep the light steady. Each loss was a flare, a burst of brilliance followed by nothing, and still the current demanded more. The beacon endured. The predators were held at bay. Hope survived. But the price was written in blood and silence, in souls spent faster than they could be replaced. For every thread of innovation that shone, others frayed and vanished. The Emperor did not stop. His attention pressed harder, more, present his grief thicker, but his will unbroken. He had chosen the spark must survive, no matter how many threads unraveled in the process. The beacon's glow held steady at last, fragile but alive, a candle refusing to die in a storm. Yet even as it burned, the ledger remained red. The Astronomican still devoured its 1,000 a day. The throne still groaned and rusted, its numbers ticking downward, its foundations faltering. Hope had been born, but it was not yet salvation. The Emperor's gaze, heavy and endless, turned inward. Behind layers of machinery, beneath the weight of centuries, there were systems-sealed doors locked since the heresy. Protocols buried, because their price had once been too high. Now, with the galaxy bleeding and the throne dying, those locks trembled. To preserve the spark, to hold the light, he would have to open doors he had sworn would never be touched again.